And we're live. Today, Whiskey Brothers and Whiskey Sisters, welcome to the Whiskey Book Club's 9th book review and the second edition of this book right here. That one right there, Whisky Japan by Dom Roskrow. And as always, we're honored to have you with us today. My name's Dolph. I'm the founder of the Whiskey Book Club. I'm your host tonight. And for those of you that don't really know us all that well, I'll explain what we are. We're geeks. We're whiskey geeks. And we're proud to be whiskey geeks. And we love to share a dram and share our passion for reading, mostly about whiskey-related activities and books in particular. There are other alcohol book clubs out there now, but none, I say none, that delve so deeply into the topic than with the author than we do here. So the choice of our 9th book is based on our ongoing desire to study Japanese whiskey on a grander scale. Because we know a bit, we all think we know a bit, but we want to know a lot more. And this is the perfect book for that, and Dom, the perfect author, guest star for us. And our guest of honor tonight, Dominic Roskrow, is prophetic whiskey writer. He's approaching 20 books and rewrites, with the most notable being Whiskey Opus, which our good friend Davin did a little portion of that, so I like to always say that. 1001 Whiskeys to Try Before You Die, The World's Best Whiskeys, and this one right here. And I'll say the whole title, Whisky Japan, The Essential Guide to the World's Most Exotic Whiskey. That one right there. It's beautiful tome. And as Don put it, this is a work of investigative journalism, and he also kind of mentioned that it's like a touring book. So if you're on a tour, you could have this book and go from city to city to city and have a good representation of the distilleries there and places to go at night or during the day and have a good time. So Don's also done, he's been the editor of Whiskey Quarterly, Whiskey Magazine, Whiskey Advocate. He's written for numerous magazines and newspapers. He's a keeper of the Quake, and we still haven't found out how he became a Kentucky colonel, but he is, and we're still looking to find that out. Let's start our roundtable introductions with our names, our other platform handles, what's in your glasses, and why we chose that. So we're going to start with our special guest, Dom, because he saw us do this last week, so he's used to it now. Continue alphabetically through the rest of the panel members, Dave, Jace, McDaddy, Kent, and Nick. Are we ready, Dom?
Yeah, okay.
You're up.
Well, I'm Dominic Roskrow. I have a Facebook account at Dom Roskrow. I'm Twitter account is at Whiskey Tasting. I don't really understand Instagram, but I'm trying to do that. And I'm drinking, again, local cider, because it's gone 8 o'clock at night now here, and if I'd started drinking whiskey, I don't know if I'd be able to stand up. So, I'm drinking. I like drinking, so I've got a long drink, and that's me.
Excellent. And I like drinking as well, and I think you're in good company with that tonight, kind sir. We all like drinking. Yeah. Dave, you're up.
Hey guys, it's Yukon Dave coming from the basement as always. I picked up this new bottle here. It's Miyagiko Single Malt. It's the second of the Nika distilleries.
I think when I have the exact same bottle today. It's hilarious.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Well, I'm really nervous buying Japanese whiskey because pure malt and all the. It's hard to find one that's actually made in Japan, and this one I believe is 100% made in Japan.
We'll find out soon enough, I think. And
all right,
Jason, you're up.
Hi everyone, my name's Jason. You can find me on Instagram. My handle is jmac_25, and I actually, just like Dave, happen to be drinking the Miyagiko non-aged Neiman. It's a good one, and I can attest that it is a real Japanese-made whiskey, and it's one of the only ones I have in my collection right now. And just want to also introduce this cup that I'm drinking from. Normally, I would drink out of a Glencairn, but because it's Japanese whiskey, I'm also drinking out of a Japanese sake cup. This one is done by an artist named Junpei Kaneshige. He's a generational potter from Bizen, Japan, and his family has been making pottery for 400 years.
Wow.
So shout out to him as well.
Thank you. And tell us, does it change the flavor? It might change how we get the aroma out of it, but how about the flavor?
Well, I've tested it alongside Glencairn's, and I find that it doesn't change the flavor, but the downside of using these kind of pottery cups is that you don't get to see the color inside. You don't get to see the legs on the side of the glass.
That might be a good thing when we're trying to do stuff blind, though. So it'd be nice to have a lineup of those. All right. Thank you very much, kind sir. Kent, you're up.
Hi, my name's Kent. I go by Whisky on pretty much all platforms. And tonight I made myself a Japanese matcha cocktail using the Centauri Toki.
Perfect. A perfect afternoon drink. We're 1 o'clock here, but Dom is 9 o'clock where he is. So this all worked out well. It's a good afternoon drink. And Nicole, finally.
Hey everyone, I go by Nick, and you can find me at Black Cat Whiskey on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I have dived into my samples, and I'm drinking Chichibu World Blend Malt and Grain, and I have on the side.
Excellent. And that was donated by our good friend Lee as well?
Yes, Lee gives me all the good Japanese whiskeys.
Excellent. All right, thank you very much. And now I'm on. Let's put my little face up there. And this is funny because I've had this in my collection behind me for well over a year and a half. And I just looked at it today. I didn't talk to either Jason or Yukon Dave, and it's just funny that we all came up with the same thing. And it's not because it's the only one available here. We probably have at most stores 7-8 varieties at larger stores of Japanese whiskey to choose from, and it's different from store to store. So I find it really odd that we got the same thing. But I will tell you that it's in this glass right here, Black Cat Whiskey, and that's Nick. So you can tell the resemblance, I guess, from Nick and her Black Cat. It's perfect. It's fantastic. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good introductions. We're going to keep it on here. I freaked Dom out the last time when I made it large on him for a large period of time because he couldn't tell we all sit. So I'm just going to keep it like this. We'll have the comments on the side. We already have tons out there. So Mr. Pollard says, thank you, good day. And number one rule is that we don't talk about the boom club and haha. And again, on my second bottle of that Mia in a very short. Wow. All right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to start where we left off here last week. I didn't get a chance to ask this question of the panel because we talked a lot last week. Things went well, but I think it worked out better for us because it gave us an extra week to think about this quote right here. And as you guys know, I like to put my quotes up. So Japanese whiskey is only relatively recently started to emerge from the fog of ignorance, but it remains an enigma and a curiosity. So I'm wondering, panel, how many of you still feel this way, or is it kind of becoming less and less of an enigma? Because we've had a week, which isn't a long time, but we have been reading this for a while. So I'll just throw that out to my panel. Is it less of an enigma, or do you still have no idea what we're talking about? I'm close to that.
Yeah, we're just on. I feel like we've missed the train. It's and going through the book and reading all the stuff we've been doing on whiskey lately in Japan. It's like I feel like we should have been drinking this in the 90s, right? Yep. Even early 2010. But now it seems like all the really good stuff they're talking about. You want to buy a bottle of everything that they're talking about in these books is $10,000-$20,000. This isn't in our budget. So, no. Right? Yeah, and I mean, this was the first bottle I ever bought, and I bought it as a sipping whiskey, and it was absolutely atrocious. Now it's a couple years old, and then I watched a show on Japanese whiskey, and they mentioned this bottle in particular about how it was the after work dram. Everybody would go to the bar after work to socialize. They made cocktails out of it. It was never intended to be a sipping whiskey. I went, I love this. So yeah, now that we're doing whiskey, I'm actually making cocktails out of it, and that's what is in my cocktail tonight. And it makes a great cocktail.
And it looks good up on the bar as well. So I think they made that with that intent, right? With that type of bottle. How about the rest of you? Are you getting your feet under you as we're exploring our Japanese whiskey yet?
Well, it sure has me curious. Like, when I read this statement, I put in Australian whiskey. I changed the word, and those didn't fit in this the way Japanese fits for me. Like I know there's a mystique about Japan that I'm interested in. And I'm really interested in their whiskey, and yeah, it's a real curiosity.
Thank you, Nick. Jason.
Well, I have a different perspective on Japanese whiskey because I lived in Asia for a long time.
Okay.
So I drank a lot of Japanese whiskey over there. So I was introduced to it. I liked it. I didn't realize that it was starting to become a rarity. And even over there, people knew what it was, but they didn't really seek it out. In fact, even the Japanese, let's say 20 years ago, they were told that, we make whiskey, but it's actually kind of inferior stuff, compared to what's made in Scotland and what have you. And then suddenly now it's a thing, and they're proud of it. And now their own people are clamoring to get whiskey and they can't get it because it's all gone now. But in Asia, a lot of people know about Japanese whiskey. So, coming back to Canada, I kind of thought people knew about it as well here. And I find that they do, but not really. So I feel that enigma still exists here in the West.
Good. And even within our group, I think the same thing. And we're part of the Alberta Scotch Society. I think you found that out as well fairly recently, that we really don't know as much as we would like to. Well, Nick, I'm going to go to you because you've had some exposure, both of you and I with Lee. I think you get a little bit more than I do, but I have a couple friends that give me stuff. And I was at the same point, just like Dave, that I never knew if it was Japanese whiskey, if it was imported whiskey. And I really had a hard time deciding and getting the information because I didn't trust all the people that would tell me. How about you?
Even though I've got a great supplier in Lee, I feel like I know very little still. Reading this book, I'll catch on a phrase or a comment. I'm like, I need to go Google this. And I get pulled down a rabbit hole. And there's just all this history, this knowledge, this culture behind Japanese whiskey. You go, well, I know nothing now. And it highlights that whole experience. Like, we really don't understand where this is coming from, and we've missed a lot, I do feel.
Yeah. Well, the golden window, we talked about that. So did Dom. Dom, let's get you involved in this conversation a little bit, kind sir, because, well, you know more, obviously, because we're reading your book. But let's give you this quote from Broom. Love Broom. So Broom rightly makes the point that it is fundamentally wrong to conclude that Japan merely copied what Scotland was doing, and that Japanese whiskey was conceived primarily through science and not through the environment. And so, Dom, I'd like you to elaborate on this, please, specifically the part that's not through the environment portion, if you could, kind sir.
All right, before I do, this is amazing. Luckily, I've got a pen and paper, so because I forget otherwise, but you've raised so many things straight away. First, I'd just very quickly like to say thank you to the Edmonton Whisky Club who sent me a message saying how much they like the book and stuff. That's very nice. Secondly, I just wanted to correct something about the Whisky Opus. Gavin was a co-author. He didn't do a little bit. Davin did a little bit. Did you say Gavin or Davin?
Davin.
Sorry. I thought because Gavin Smith also Davin. Sorry, that's fine. Yeah, Davin only did the Canadian bit.
Yeah.
A German guy did some of the German stuff, and then Gavin and I split it, and he pretty much did Scotland, and I did everything else. So just to make that point.
So cheers to Gavin. Thank you to Davin. And let's continue.
And again, very, very quickly, just to go back, the fact the three of you have got that whiskey, it's a single malt whiskey from a distinctive distillery. And it's did we talk about this last week about how Nika was going bust?
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, that's why this exists. And I think for a non-aged whiskey, it's really outstanding. So anyway, that's all the messages that came up before. The point I was making with regard to that quote about Dave Broom was this, that if you go to Ireland and you've got lots of grains, the Irish set about making a style that suited their own palate. They came up with a pot still whiskey style, which was using unmalted grains as well as malted grains to avoid paying tax. But you didn't pay tax on unmalted grain. So by using unmalted grain, it meant they didn't pay tax to the British. So they developed a style that was very much from their environment, and it's very unlike Scotch. And although they tried to, in the economic crises of the 1960s, etc., they tried to make it like a Scotch light. Actually, now it's diversified back to where it should be. And it's very much a product of the environment. And the other thing, of course, about Ireland is it has a lot of peat. So the idea that we had all Irish whiskey had to be like Jameson, which was triple distilled, blended, 40%, no peat, gone out the window. Ireland's a peat bog, and they would have used peat originally. Same with America. Americans, Kentucky, they came there. It was a fantastic place to grow corn. So the farmers who settled there grew corn, and from the excess grain, they made what became bourbon or corn whiskey. The water's hard there as opposed to the soft water of Scotland. So this is why their racehorses are so strong-limbed. They're getting water that's rich in calcium, so it makes for strong bones, and it makes a great whiskey. So everybody sort of shorthanded. What's happened with Japan, in my view, is that because we couldn't understand the language and we couldn't understand the culture, and I grew up with comics that had kamikaze pilots. In England, we had Second World War comic books where Japanese all had a headband with a red. They're all kamikaze pilots, and I'm going banzai, banzai, and that was our level of knowledge about Japan. It really was that poor. So we just absolutely used racist shorthand to describe a very, very nuanced culture, far too nuanced and sophisticated for us, and certainly with the language and the culture, and so alien. And Japan is never been particularly bothered about telling. A bit like Canada, actually. Excuse me, my dog's just ripping my. Can you get down? Canada's a bit like Japan in the sense that it doesn't really care about it. It's not interested in me coming and telling the story. That that Japan doesn't favor journalism. We talked about this last week with Stefan and how he was able to learn the language and spend 4 years and build trust. I couldn't do any of that. So that's what I mean by that. That there was a view. We said, well, look, they're making whiskey and they're trying to copy the Scots. And before they did single malt whiskey, this dog's really, really.
Well, you can bring the puppy up with you as well. Put him right on your lap if you want.
Yeah, no, he's in his most lively mood. I've asked the family to take him away, but they haven't. I can't get him. He's too lively. Can you see him jumping around in the background?
Oh, yeah.
It's cute.
Oh, there he is. He's trying to get mine. It's a real leveler. Sorry.
Start curling them. You worked on your muscles.
Yeah. Oh, that's what I do. Yeah, that's exactly what I do with those dogs, the sausage dog things. Yeah. I spend a good 20 minutes doing exactly that. And then I take him for a walk and he pulls. Anyway, we went off the point. So what I was trying to say was we just assumed that Japanese wanted whiskey. Before they did use grain, they made all sorts of drinks. All sorts of drinks that they called whiskey but had nothing to do with whiskey at all. And they gave them Scottish names. This is 150 years ago. So we just assumed the whole thing was to copy, and we came up with I've used it. I've said it's a bit like cars, the Japanese came and looked at our cars, made them better, more efficient, but they were copies. And the point I'm making, and Dave Broom made first, is actually that's not the case at all. We can start with the most obvious, Mizunara wood, used for maturation of Japanese whiskey. It's very distinctive. But Japanese production methods, I'm not even sure it's not Miyagiko. They have 10, 20, 30 different still sizes. And they use any number of different woods to mature that. And they make new make spirits. They've got a huge range of new make spirits. And so their whiskey production is very nuanced. And the truth of the matter is that somebody said before, I wish they'd been there in the 90s. Most single malt whiskey that wasn't sold laid down. It wasn't matured for 18 or 25 years. That's a relatively new thing. That happened at the turn of the millennium. So if you'd gone to Japan in the 90s and drank whiskey, you'd have had single malts and you'd have had a range of different products, but you wouldn't necessarily get to try the Yamazaki 18-year-old or the 25. So my point is that Japanese whiskey makers are also very, very innovative. So they're now taking, they've bought Suntory have bought Morrison Bowmore. So they're taking peated Bowmore casks and experimenting with flavor. So there's lots of stuff happening, but we simply didn't understand, and they weren't exactly forthright in telling us. That's my view, and that's fine. As somebody quite rightly said, when we did find out, we took it all. It's gone.
We're buying it all.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. So, Kent, we wouldn't have gone there in our 20s. We would have had to have gone in our 30s, and that's okay because we had a little bit more money in our 30s. We could have bought a whole bunch more, too.
I fully agree.
Perfect. In the 2000s. Let's go to here. I've got this. I found it really, really interesting that in the mid-1950s, Suntory specifically established 1,500 Tories bars to serve whiskeys. Yep. So, Panel and Dom, do you agree that this seems like a good idea? If this is your company, if you're promoting your whiskey, let's just open our own bars everywhere. And I'm wondering if there's any Scottish, Irish, American, Canadian companies that did anything like this, because it seems like a pretty smart idea. I want to promote my whiskey. Let's just open my bars and have mostly my whiskey there. I think it's a good idea. Anyone else?
I wouldn't see so much whiskey here. I would say more beer, because you go into the bars, they are very much brand specific bars here, where they probably weren't owned by the whiskey or the beer companies, but they definitely had, you want our product, you have to have all our product or nothing.
Well, it smacks of Tied House, and I had lunch with a guy from Europe one time, and he was one of the top executives, and they own 252 breweries around the world. And he says he hates coming to North America because it's so confusing, because in Europe, if you need a loan to get a bar, the brewery will give you a loan, but you sell their product.
Oh.
He said here, everybody owns a bar and they got their hands out and they want different deals. He said, it's just crazy what you guys are doing. And that's what this looked like to me. But that one statement that you put in there, Dom, on page 32, Suntory established the Tory bars to take advantage of the salarymen. All these guys are drinking. We want to make sure they drink my product. So let's get 2,000 bars.
I think that's the key point. The key point here is you're absolutely right. So in the UK, this is where I came in, 1991, I came back from New Zealand, and we were just going through the beer orders, because what we had basically free traders who were independent. They could buy from wherever they wanted, so they got great deals because everybody wanted to be in their free trade bars. Okay. We had managers, and the managers were in tied estates where it was Tetley's pub. They had to sell the Tetley's products, but they were able to get competitive prices because the brewery was setting them, and they were able to basically get a living salary. And then you had tenants, and tenants had to do deals. And when they did those deals, they got screwed on price. So it was seen as vastly unfair. So in 1991, literally when I came back from New Zealand, they made a law that if you were a brewery, you could only have a limited, I won't go through the whole mathematics of it, but you were restricted on how many pubs you could have. So they sold them all off to, my first magazine in the UK was Free Trade Buyer, because suddenly all these pubs were being sold off. And the idea was lots of individuals would buy them and they'd be free traders, but they didn't. New companies set up, and to this day, Wetherspoons is our most famous one probably, but Enterprise, Pubmaster, and they bought 300-400 pubs and then did a deal with a brewery. So nothing changed.
Okay.
Big difference. A big difference with that story and Japan is that nobody, I don't know about in Canada, but you would never run a business based on a spirit brand. People are not going to go out and say, I'm going to Macallan bar tonight because I want to drink Macallan. Most whiskey is sold at home because it's expensive in the on-trade.
Okay.
And nobody drinks, especially with the drink driving rules and everything else. Nobody really goes out to a pub or to a bar just to drink spirits. They might go drink cocktails. That's a bit different. But you couldn't do what was different was that, and back me if I'm wrong on this, but when I lived in New Zealand, these tourist trips used to come over, and they were all from the same company. And they'd follow a flag around, and they go to the same bars and the same tour. And so in Japan, back in those days, when people finished work, all these salarymen finished work, they'd all go to the pub. And that was the only place you could criticize your boss. You could go in there and tell him that you didn't like something. And I say him quite deliberately. This was a very male, hard-drinking culture that Suntory were able to take advantage of. So I don't think there's any comparison to that anywhere else in the world. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think so.
No, Dom is right. There is that culture in Japan that what happens in the bar stays at the bar. So you could go to the bar with your boss, get blitzed, and mouth them off, and the next day go to work and it's all good.
Okay.
Yeah, bizarre, isn't it? It's very strange. But this is the whole thing. It's about nuance of culture, you know. I think, you know, I mentioned it in the first couple of pages about the film Lost in Translation, because what that really was about, in simple terms, was American shorthand or Western shorthand introduced to nuanced culture that's far more sophisticated, far more delicate, far more what's the word? Genteel.
Nuance? Okay.
Yeah, you know, and I think that's the first time, you know, my mother wouldn't drink Japanese whiskey because she lived through the Second World War. Simple as that. You know, I was born in 1961. It was only 16 years after Hiroshima. So I grew up in a culture which would be unacceptable. You see, I don't think back on it. It's just so unacceptable. But there was nobody defending Japan or even trying to represent Japan. It was just so we've moved a long, long way. Anyway,
so I think that statement is interesting because I'd like to know a lot more about it. Is how did they set this up? Was it you only carried our Suntory products, or were you allowed to do, or was Suntory promoting stuff?
Or did they buy the bars themselves and put their own managers there?
Like, I think that could be a chapter in itself on how that all folded out. And nowadays it's gone basically, right, Dom?
Yeah. Is it gone?
Well, there's
actually it's still there. There are branded whiskey bars, sake bars, as well as beer bars. For example, even Mikkeller, which is a famous brewer, they have Mikkeller bars in Tokyo as well. So they do obviously promote their product mostly, but you can get other choices as well, because at the end of the day, you want to make money, so you want to have some other selections to make that profit. But yeah, I think it's a great idea. I wish there was more of it here. I mean, I think we're quite fortunate right now with the craft beer boom in the West that we have a lot going. But can you imagine if we had dedicated whiskey boutique bars? Oh man.
I'd really like that. But then again, would they have the young people that would populate it to have it make money? I'm wondering.
This is a really interesting thing, though, because when I told you at the start of this that I was going to nick the idea and maybe do it elsewhere, the first person I went to was Amy Seaton. And when I first met Amy, she was running a very small whiskey show in Birmingham, which is our second biggest city, but it wasn't a big show. I went to it. It wasn't a big show. She had I did a few whiskey tastings in pubs that had good whiskey offerings. Mm-hmm. And now if you look her up, I think it's called the Birmingham Whiskey Tasting Club. It's a bar. She's got her own bar, and and you'll see she's doing loads of virtual things with various distillers and brand ambassadors. And I don't know how many hours she works, but she's got staff. And she's doing it. So, but she has worked incredibly hard. Birmingham's a big city, so it's probably more feasible. There are 3 or 4 dedicated whiskey bars in London. I haven't been to any of them for a very long time for obvious reasons, but it's just, I don't know about you, but our measures are so pathetic and our tax is so high that you've got to have big pockets to make a night out in. Well, I mean, there are bars in London in the book, but it's not a cheap way to spend your money.
No, which is why we need a lot of good friends like we have here. We could go to 3 different friends' house and have a different whiskey every night for 10 years if we wanted to. If we wanted to do something like that. So, and that would be fun. Maybe that's something to do. Keep that in the back of our minds. Maybe at retirement, a different house. I'll take like Monday or Tuesday, and Kent Tuesday, Wednesday, and then we'll go to a different place every day. Different.
Well, there's an event that you may have heard of that's held in Belgium every year.
Yes.
Is it called Whisky Fest? But that's all they do. They go to a campsite sort of environment.
Okay.
And you go along, you buy a ticket to go and stay, and then you take a bottle of whiskey, and they do swapping, basically. They all get to drink everybody else's whiskey, and it's I've never done it, so I'm talking secondhand, but I've written about it before. So it can be done, but I think that's the only way you can make it worthwhile. If you're paying, whiskey and sharing everyone else's, rather than paying bar prices, which have obviously got a markup.
Yep. And I like the comment that's down there right now. It might actually help make whiskey more approachable to everybody if it had a dedicated bar. And you were maybe someone, you just go in and you try 5 different cocktails or something within something you would have never tried before, a whiskey and a bartender that would know enough about whiskey and scotch. And there's not a lot of bartenders that do where I've been in Calgary and Edmonton, even in Victoria, Vancouver, there's not a whole bunch. So I think you have to find the right bar in the right circumstance to be able to do that. But if we had these dedicated bars, I think they would help focus you. I think that'd be a good idea.
Well, here's a good retirement plan for you, Dolph. I know 2 bars. I know 2 bars in Taiwan. They're hidden bars. They're actually, the front is a liquor store. And I had been to these liquor stores several times before I found out that there was a bar behind the store. And I found out because you had to get to know the owner for a while. And then the bar is by invite only.
Nice.
So suddenly you get led to a back room and ta-da, there's a bar there.
This happens a lot in the East, doesn't it? Japan does this a lot as well, almost like you're going into somebody's living room and all this sort of private. I love all that. I think that's really cool.
Yeah,
I do. It's like going to a speakeasy and all the mystique around going to a speakeasy. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And the best ones are when I once did one in Dublin, and we ended up in this most amazing speakeasy, etc. And then when I came out the next day, I couldn't remember where I'd been. So,
where am I?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. New question coming up, because we talked about innovation. We talked about Suntory, but I like the Akechi Distillery. And I've got another quote. So Akechi Distillery has planned for production by buying new make spirit from 2 other distilleries and experimenting with maturation times. So, and they did this in a small storage facility. It looks like they built a little mini house on the spot that they're be maturing the whiskey in the future. So I think it's a really cool idea. But I'm wondering if it's unique. You're going to you're going to have a distillery. You want to mature in this area, but you want to experiment to see how long it matures and how it reacts with different types of wood. So does anyone else on the panel know of anyone else that's done this? Because I think that's really cool.
Yeah, that house looked really, the storage facility looked really interesting to me, and I like that idea. But I think as small guys are experimenting all the time because we really don't know how things are going to turn out. Yeah, well, I was going to say that, but I caught myself.
I'll take the hint of being rude.
Yeah.
I'm sure they know what they're doing. However, if I was to make whiskey, like maybe I've tried, it might be a good idea to try to experiment a little, or pre-experiment, because that's what they're doing. Before they go on a large scale, they're seeing how it's going to mature. They'll have a better idea before they start.
I had it explained to me really easy. They said, we make beer. That's kind of an art, making the wash, and then distilling is a mechanical process, and then the barrels is, that's the mystery. Like those barrels, you get all the same barrels, but they all react different. So you just.
Dom, do you think this is the first time?
I think I'm sitting here a little bit trying to rack my brain a bit, because I think when I wrote that book, I had to draw blood out of a stone even to get that much information on Akeshi. It was just, I don't even know if it's been built. It was just a northern plot of peat bog. Yeah. And I think things have changed massively since then, and I think all sorts of experimentations going on. We talked a bit about craft beer. I'm a member of a club here, and I get sent 12 cans a month. And that's an interesting comment from Drew Semper there.
Yeah.
Very interesting. The beers are being sent to me, and increasingly I'm getting more porters and stouts. And this is a bit of a joke, because Guinness changed the reputation of stout from an old woman's drink, literally, or sometimes given to somebody for an ill health, to a trendy drink called Guinness. And most people don't know what stout is. They think Guinness is Guinness. Now they're playing with the definitions, and they're going right back. And so the change of what's happening in the industry in terms of experimentation, and I'm very open, and I'm mentioning this openly now, to the idea of looking at how things work, because you're quite right. You put two cars together and they'll mature differently. So even if they experiment with maturation, they're not going to reproduce exactly what they want anyway. So, and that is the magic. I believe you can bring some science, and so I work with Seven Seals, which is a Swiss company, and they have deconstructed the barrel. So basically what they do is they treat the wood to take out all the negative factors, and then they treat the wood to put in all the positive factors, and they increase the oak to liquid ratio so it matures faster. Now, I can't back that as a whiskey, but if they give me 3.5-year-old whiskey, and after 4 years it tastes like it's 15 to 18 years old, which it does, I just think they've not broken any laws. They started with whiskey. All they've done is finish it, which is totally legitimate. That's not the same as maturation to me. So I think there's lots of people looking at lots of different ways of, the barrel was the idea of a cask. It was an accident, but it's a very inefficient way of maturing anything. And the other thing is, Scotland may take 10 to 12 years, but we're seeing Jim Swan's distilleries. Dr. Jim Swan's dead now, but he worked with distilleries all over the world, and they're maturing stuff in 4 years. Cotswolds is about to be announced. I announced my award winners next week. And the English Distiller of the Year, and potentially the World Craft Distiller of the Year, is Cotswolds. Nice. And they're 20 years old, and they win awards in blind tastings everywhere. So the idea so I think what I'm trying to say is that I reckon the Japanese are very, very canny when it comes to making whiskey. And I'm sure that Suntory and Nikka have put a lot of money into finding ways to outpace quickly Diageo, given the fact that they had to stop. Because that's the thing about my book. It's written at the time where whoever said, I feel that we missed it, we should have been. It's almost like, ha, 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 I tasted all this, you can't. But I guarantee that's about to change, because I think Tokyo Olympics will be the stage where suddenly we'll see a surge of, and some of it may be very young. Chichibu is very young. Chichibu is very young, but incredibly well made. Not so young now because he's been around a while. But I don't know, that bottling there's probably only 4 years old. You've got, and he'll have made the two components in the same distillery. So. Is it a blend? Is it a single malt? What is it? It's got grain in it, but so John Glazer does this at Compass Box. So there's also, I can't believe the Japanese aren't trying everything to come up with exciting and innovative whiskies. And I think the decision to bring in a definition about their blended whiskey has been made so that nobody can turn around and say they're false. That's what I think.
Yeah. And I agree. I think it's a fantastic idea. Also fantastic. We had Sheila made comments on the side, and this does happen. Alberta, we had ours, Alberta Premium, and well, not just us, but there's different distilleries in the States as they're growing up. They're going through their growing pains. They import for us. We produce a lot of rye in our province. We send that rye abroad, and they make it their own, and they learn from that process before they start distilling their own. But I'm with you, Dom. Even though it's the same cask, once they start dealing with their own distillate, I think it will change the flavor, and they still have to adapt. So even though they've made some progress maybe in their minds as to what they're going to do, I think once they actually have their own distillate, their own new make in their own barrels, I think that's still going to change. But
Dom, do you think that the Japanese are also playing with higher levels of technology than the rest of the distilling world, like nano distilling?
God, that's a big question.
That's good.
I don't know the answer to that. I have to say I don't know the answer. I would say that some of the methods of making whiskey in America are embarrassingly, there's somewhere in Silicon Valley that says they can recreate the molecular structure of Scotch whiskey overnight. Yeah. Bullshit. Yeah, I'm sorry. If you're not, you can't this idea of adding a bag of chips and spices into a neutral grade spirit and coming up with a whiskey that's got any molecular structure. It hasn't withdrawn any of the negatives out of the spirit. It's just, so I think there's lots of people using lots of technology, but whether they're actually making anything worthwhile is another matter entirely. And I would be almost certain the Japanese will be doing it properly. I say the Japanese, I don't know. But Suntory and Nikka, which is what, 88% of the industry, or was, my figures might be a bit out of date because of the recent, fall off of supply. But those big companies, Suntory Beam is the size it is because they make very, very fine products. You can get away with a bad product once, and I get sent loads of stuff that's dreadful. But Beam is a great product. Suntory whiskey is a great product. So I would argue that other people are probably using the technology, but whether they're doing it properly or not is another matter entirely.
Do you think the concept of nano distilling has any potential where they're trying to improve the chemical reactions without affecting the thermodynamics of the actual whiskey distillation process?
I don't know enough about that to be able to answer. I'm not a scientist. I'll be honest with you. I'm not going to try and bullshit you. I don't know. But you see, at the end of the day, I'm all about taste, and I'm all about enjoyment of the whiskey. And I'm from the art side. I'm a writer, and so I'm from the art side of the process, not the science side. And so when I start hearing about chemical reactions, people getting degrees from Heriot-Watt University, and they're able to. The Swedes are big on this. Haven, Spirit of Haven, Eric Molina. He wants to put, instead of the age of whiskey, he wants to have symbols showing that the maturation process is complete. Oh no, you're talking science. You're asking someone in a supermarket to say, "Oh, scientifically, this is a good whiskey." I personally don't get it. So when you start talking about things like, and as soon as you tell me that they're making it in a laboratory, in a suburb of Los Angeles, I just kind of think, it doesn't sound anything like the whiskey. I want to see the burns and the bends, and I want to walk along the locks, and call me old fashioned, but.
You don't want to lose the mystique of it all. You like the mystique, the whiskey,
the magic.
Yeah.
Nicole,
I'm going to put this comment on.
Dr. Don Livermore.
Sorry?
told Nicole we should just ask that question to Dr. Don Livermore. JP Weiser's here in Canada.
And he likes his science, and he's got his doctorate there. So we'll hold on to that question when we talk to Don, and we should fairly soon, I think.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to put this up because Tim agreed with me, so I just wanted to put that up there. It's kind of out of left field. He does. It's expensive, and you need someone who knows their stuff at a bar to actually serve it to you. So there, done. Thank you very much.
Well, I just comment on that. There's a bar in my city, nearest city, Norwich. I haven't been there for years. In fact, I think they've moved into gin. But for a while, they tried to set themselves up as a whiskey bar, and eventually they came to me to see if I'd get involved with them. And basically, what they wanted me to do was just provide them with my knowledge for there was no deal involved with it, so it didn't happen. But they had Flaming Heart from Compass Box.
Yep.
And on their menu, they had a great whiskey menu, but on their menu it said £9.50 for a shot. Now, I couldn't afford a bottle of Flaming Hearts, but if something really special happened, I could go in there and for a tenner, treat myself to this really special dram, one of my favorite whiskeys in the world. And the reason it was always there was because not one single person knew what they got.
Yeah.
Not Flaming Hearts.
That's it.
Wow.
It's the big one. It's the 1 point whatever liter.
How much did that cost
1.5
me?
liter.
It's the one they call the Magnum.
Yeah,
What
the
do they
Magnum.
what do they charge for that?
This was close
$330?
to $300, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's pretty good though. But anyway, the point they're making is that if they'd been able to tell the story and explain what they got and explain why it was rare and it wasn't easy to get and blah, it was an original bottle of Flaming Heart, the very first edition. And people don't necessarily want cheap; they want value for money. But at £9.50 without a story, ain't going to sell. So I knew what I was getting, but they didn't know how to sell it. I'll never forget that story because it's exactly what you're saying. Exactly what you're saying.
Yep. You need the culture behind it. You need the knowledge, the culture, and the appreciation for both. I think from someone who's going to present it, and I would love to work in a place like that, to tell you the truth. I would give up teaching, and I would sit behind the bar at night, 5 nights a week, maybe 6 nights a week, if I could do something like that and still make almost what I do as a teacher. I think I'd do it just for fun.
Have I got time? This is an after dram story, I think.
You go right ahead. We've got 13 minutes, and if we'll just bring it over to the after jam.
I'll just tell you the story. It's Colin Dunn's story. You know, Colin Dunn, who works for Diageo now.
Yep.
He's a brand ambassador for Diageo, very, very engaging person, and he's been a big supporter of mine. He came to my very first live tasting and saved my ass. I mean,
Really?
it was awful. Dave Broom was there, and I said, "Don't come, Dave." He said, "I need to see what the opposition's up to." It was on a Friday night, 8 o'clock, so everybody had a lot to drink. Anyway, Colin saved my life. And the story he told was the very story I'm about to tell you. It's how old it is. But he was in a bar. He used to work for Morrison Bowmore, and they've got Auchentoshan.
Yep.
And he was in a bar, and he's having a dram at the end of the day, and there was a New Zealand barman and an American customer, one customer in the bar, and a New Zealander working behind the bar. And the American kept saying, "Wait, what's that one? What's that one?" And the New Zealander knew all the answers. Colin said he was doing really well till he got to Auchentoshan 3-wood.
Okay.
And he goes, "What's the Auchentoshan 3-wood?" And the New Zealander said, "They also do a 7-iron, and next year they're launching putter."
Perfect.
And the American bought it, right?
I think that's a good answer, though. I would be fantastic.
Colin said you can't afford it. He bought one. Anyway, that's the point about knowledge. Actually, I think that's changing. I think that we over here certainly have a lot more people that have tuned in and actually learned something about. So we've got some very good barmen and some who've sort of, I discovered this cider company. It was on television, actually. I saw this cider company on one of our shows about Cornwall. And Roskrow's a Cornish name. So I emailed the cider farm. I said, "Look, I'm a writer. I'll write about your cider, but I'm Cornish. Well, I've got a Cornish name.
Mhm.
Could I try your cider? It sounds fantastic. And he said, no, you can have it. You don't have to do anything with it. Do you know Nick Strangeway? And I went, no, serious? Nick Strangeway lives 100 yards from this farmer in Cornwall. But Nick Strangeway opened bars like, I've got this the wrong way around. I always get these two mixed up. It's not Nick Strangeway, it's the other one. Doesn't matter. The other guy, Stevenson, his name's Tristan Stevenson. Tristan's Cornish name. Tristan Stevenson. And he opened some of our trendiest London bars, Pearl and the Something Street Whistling Shop, which is an old gin palace. Mm-hmm. And this guy has gone from writing a little bit because he's a barman to being absolutely up there beyond me because he's really into cocktails and he knows the bar scene. The other person I mentioned, Nick Strangeway, is also the same. So we do have people who are not only knowledgeable in the bar sector, but they're actually brilliant in the bar sector. And they get on Sunday morning television and stuff like that, saying, you should try this. It's a very good drop and that sort of thing. Yeah.
And I like that. And we do have our whiskey ambassadors here doing that. But I'm talking about the bar. Let's say I want to open a bar, and it's a whiskey bar. I would want every male, female that is serving to have a background and a knowledge and something they can contribute to anybody, which means the whiskey novice to someone that comes in that's been drinking for 10, 15 years, right?
But Sheila Semper's point is correct at the bottom now. This is what whiskey ambassadors do. So when we allowed out again, I will take my Seven Seals whiskey and I'll take my Fable whiskey, and I'll do 3 events in a day. I'll go to a bar.
Wow.
I'll do bloggers, writers, journalists, etc.
Okay.
I'll do an afternoon tasting for bartenders, anybody in the industry who wants to come along for free and listen to me tell them about these products and whether they would like to stock them. And then I will give the pub or bar that I'm in a free whiskey tasting for its customers in the evening. And all of that will be funded by my 2 employers. So Sheila's quite right that actually you can go a long way now with quite, if you're keen and in the bartender, where we've changed, and I can't talk for Canada, but where we've changed is once upon a time, the only people who worked in bars over here were Australians and Irishmen. Because it wasn't a career. Now it's very, very much a career, and people realize the more they learn and more they get on, the better the more they achieve. They end up as bar managers or getting employed by one of the really cool bars in London, hotels and stuff. So they have a thirst for knowledge and they start young. But that's for Britain. That's happened in 20 years.
How about the cocktail industry? I think it's fairly strong in the cocktail industry.
It's starting to boom.
And in the States. Well, everywhere, but let's just talk about the 2 that I've seen or online often, where the knowledge and the people, they're making a name for themselves through creation of cocktails and being able to do this on a continual basis. So whatever bar it is in New York and then changing again, and then the competition between them is really kind of cool.
There's a fierce, I was just going to say, there's a fierce rivalry between America and the UK. So what we would say is we have some of the coolest bourbon in the world, and they're just incredibly creative, and they're going back to Victorian recipes, and we have Heston Blumenthal. It basically is basing a lot of his food ideas. I don't know if you know Heston Blumenthal, but he's won any number of awards. The Something Duck the Fat Duck has been the best pub in the world a couple of times, and he's now in a hotel. He's in this Mandarin Oriental, and he takes a lot of middle-aged, like 17th century, 18th century recipes and creates old-fashioned British fare. Well, people like Tristan Stevenson they're taking those ideas and applying them to alcohol, and they come out with these great big bowls full of smoke that they put in. And then the middle of this is a Lafroig that, there's a lot of, but America equally invented the cocktail. And when it comes to classic cocktails, America is where it's at. So they're very reluctant to accept that they are not the total king of the cocktail. So there's actually quite a lot of friction. It's very, very competitive.
Really?
But then if you're online, if you go on Amazon and look up cocktail books and see where they're coming from, it's just amazing.
Dom, carrying on that comment, one of the rabbit holes I fell down as I was reading on cocktails with Japanese whiskey is they had talked about the Japanese bar culture that sort of sustained cocktails when the Americans got sucked into prohibition, and they're actually the ones who kept it going, creating all that perfection and that pristine cocktail history, while America was drinking tea during prohibition, and it's only once prohibition was lifted that bar culture and that cocktail culture came back to America. So that's owed to that Japanese focus.
Yeah, there's another point to that. It's a very good point. In fact, it came up very early tonight. It's another thing I should have written down and didn't. But what Japan did was when all the salarymen started to fade away, Japanese culture, Japanese economy tanked, and things started to change. A lot of things changed in terms of attitudes, and particularly towards women. And in Japan, women in the workplace started to become more of a thing, and it changed. And one of the ways that Suntory took that step was to come up with the highball of,
that one right there.
Glass and with great big golf ball styles ice. And they managed to, because, and I'm stereotyping, and I'm really sorry, but I have sat in bars watching people from the East drink spirits like we drink wine, and it's incredible. I went to the Grand National, and Martell was the sponsor, and they had all their Japanese, and the Japanese made them do like drinking races with cognac. The French it's unheard of, and they had to drink it down and put it in their head. You could almost see.
Oh, they would have been so mad.
The head of Puerto Rico, I think it was, Mattel at the time, I can't remember. But you could almost see them kind of sliding through their teeth. But that's absolutely right. You go to a Japanese restaurant here, and it's quite normal to have a diluted whiskey with water and ice served as a long drink. And that's exactly what happened. And you're absolutely right. And so it's not just at the time of Prohibition. It's actually as recently as like the change of the millennium, that when nobody knew. You might, if I was to do a dinner and serve whiskey with every course, people would be horrified.
Yeah.
But if I say, right, we're going to have a whiskey with our appetizer or whiskey with our dessert, that's acceptable. But because the drink's low in alcohol, it's a replacement for wine in many ways. So you're quite right. Japan absolutely stole a march. Am I right on this? Because I'm aware. I ask you because, Jason, because I haven't been in Japan for a while, and things change so fast now that I'm a little bit nervous that some of the stuff in that book is starting to age.
Well, I think you're correct. I've been to weddings where rather than having, say, a bottle of wine on the table, they would have like a bottle of Macallan 10-year-old. And you finish that and you ask the waiter for another bottle, and people are drowning that bottle of scotch at the wedding with their meal.
It's funny because they do it at Sikh weddings. If you're ever fortunate enough to get invited to a Sikh wedding, they have a home and away. So the bride has a day and the groom has a day. And they like to lavish gifts on their guests. And putting a single malt whiskey on the table is a way of doing that. And I, when I came back from New Zealand, I came back because I met a French girl, and I moved to Paris. Nightmare. But on the first night we were there, we went to Les Bains Douches, which was the old communal shower areas that become a very upmarket, formal nightclub. Ooh. And the only thing that got me about it was they always went on about chic Paris, but these people were really traditionally dressed, like bow ties and, really traditional. And we were allowed to jump the queue because we had a connection there.
Nice.
Queues to get in. And we sat down at the table and they put down a bottle of Macallan. That's exactly what they put down, and offered us cocaine. Now, that was in the early 90s. And I thought, well,
That's a different chaser, isn't it? It's like
I thought you pour the cocaine into the Macallan. I mean, is that sort of like a whiskey and coke?
Yeah, there we go. Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, with the whiskey and coke that some of us might want to try one day, that's it for the Whiskey Book Club. We're moving our conversation from this, we'll call this formalized format, to a more relaxed and engaging and probably even more colorful conversation. Author Dominic Roskrow of Whisky Japan. Here's the book right here, The Essential Guide to the World's Most Exotic Whiskey.
Thank you.
Will, of course, be joining us. And really, what better activity is there than talking whiskey and spending time with fantastic people? So you really, really, really should join us. And so we'll be back in about 5 minutes on this channel and for the After Jam. That's what it's called. And if you don't want to miss a minute of our final week with Dom next week, March 20th, click the like, click the subscribe button, and we shall see you all in about 15 minutes. So cheers to you all, Sancha, and have a fantastic afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully we see you, and Dom, you too.